Early March 1943, the air above Port Moresby carried a strange stillness, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. A single B-25 Mitchell stood in the open light, its nose stripped of glass, replaced by a solid wall of metal and guns. It was a machine that should not exist, a machine born from loss, defiance, and one man's refusal to accept fate. Inside a dusty maintenance hangar, Captain Paul Irvin, Pappy Gunn, wiped the sweat from his brow and stared at the aircraft he had rebuilt with his own hands. He was not thinking about medals or regulations or what Washington would say if they ever discovered what he had done. He was thinking about the faces of his wife and 4 children, imprisoned far away in Manila, surviving each day on hope alone. Every bolt tightened on that aircraft, every weapon mounted, every risk taken in secret, was a promise he had made to himself. If he could not save his family with his own hands, he would end the war with them. And soon, the sea north of New Guinea would witness the full force of that promise. Early March 1943, the heat over Port Moresby wavered like a thin veil, rising from the concrete, drifting past rows of aircraft waiting for their next mission. Mechanics worked with their shirts tied around their waists, engines roared somewhere in the distance, and the unmistakable smell of oil and burned metal hung over every corner of the airfield. Yet at the center of it all, one aircraft drew more whispers than others. A B-25 Mitchell with no glass nose, no bombardier's compartment, just steel and guns. Captain Paul Irvin, Pappy Gunn, stood beneath its shadow, wiping grease from his fingers while staring at the machine he had reshaped. The aircraft looked nothing like the bomber that had rolled out of North American Aviation's factory. This one carried something different, something improvised, something unapproved, something born from a war he fought inside himself. For most men in the Southwest Pacific, the war had begun with orders, deployments, and logistics. For Gunn, it began with the sound of Manila burning. 2 years earlier, on December 8, 1941, Manila time, Japanese bombers swept across the Philippines with ruthless precision. Gunn, then working for Philippine Airlines, had watched from Nicholsfield as American aircraft were destroyed on the ground, one after another. Behind that wall of smoke was the city where his wife, Polly, and 4 children lived. He had tried to get them out, had begged for transport space, had chased rumors of evacuation corridors, but the Japanese advance closed faster than any aircraft could fly. By late January 1942, they were taken prisoner in Santo Tomas internment camp. That day, something inside him hardened. From then on, every flight he made, every bolt he tightened, every risk he took inside a maintenance hangar carried a singular purpose: end the war quickly enough for his family to live through it. He flew transports under fire. He crash-landed in the jungle and walked out again. He scavenged parts in the ruins of airfields. He pushed aircraft past their mechanical limits because waiting meant giving time back to the enemy. But innovation was not encouraged in the wartime bureaucracy. The United States Army Air Forces had manuals, approval channels, and engineering boards. Pappy Gunn had none of those, and yet he had something the manual did not: 20 years of flying, fixing, and surviving inside aircraft. When General George C. Kenney took command of Allied Air Forces in mid-1942, he walked into a disaster. Morale was low. Aircraft availability was collapsing. Japanese convoys sailed with confidence. High-altitude bombing, once the pride of American doctrine, was hitting less than 1% of its targets. War in the Pacific demanded something the handbook did not contain. Kenney had heard whispers of someone modifying a 20 Havocs in New Guinea. Someone who ripped out bombardier positions, welded machine gun mounts from salvage fighters, and test flew his own creations. That someone was Gunn. When Kenney visited the forward base and saw what Gunn had done, he didn't ask for explanations. He didn't threaten punishment. He simply said, "From now on, you work for me." And so the path to the Battle of the Bismarck Sea began. Not in a command tent, not in a war room, but in a cluttered workshop filled with acetylene torches, piles of scrap metal, and one man's fury. The B-25 Mitchell, in its original form, was a respectable medium bomber. Twin engines, crew of 5, a glass nose for a bombardier. A weapon meant to fly high, drop bombs at altitude, and rely on its defensive guns to survive the return home. But high-altitude bombing did nothing to stop Japanese supply convoys weaving through the waters north of New Guinea. Ships maneuvered. Pilots struggled to aim. The Japanese delivered troops with frightening efficiency. Ground forces suffered because no matter how many bombs were dropped, Japanese reinforcements kept arriving. Gunn looked at the B-25 and saw something no one else dared imagine. A gunship, a low-altitude predator built to tear into ships and silence anti-aircraft gunners so bombs could strike at mast height. He started by removing the bombardier entirely. The glass nose came off, replaced by a solid metal shell. Inside that new shell, he mounted 4.50 caliber Brownings, all firing forward. Then 2 more guns in cheek blisters. Then 2 more in the dorsal turret, locked to fire forward. 8 guns total. A broadside of firepower no medium bomber had ever carried. The recoil threatened to rattle the aircraft apart. The center of gravity shifted forward so aggressively that some pilots said the plane nodded even on the ground. Ammunition belts jammed from heat. The nose vibrated like a living creature under sustained fire. Gunn solved each problem one by one, reinforcing the nose, adding airflow channels, repositioning equipment, adjusting gun convergences with a craftsman's patience. Every machine he modified was tested personally. Sometimes he landed with fresh smoke still lingering inside the nose. His hands carried burn marks from overheated barrels. But soon the modified B-25 Strafer came into being. Part bomber, part gun platform, part improvisation, and entirely lethal. By late 1942, Gunn had enough aircraft configured to supply the 91st and 3rd Attack Groups. Major Ed Larner, chosen to command the B-25 Strafers, studied the aircraft with a mix of awe and disbelief. This wasn't a bomber anymore. It was a blade, a tool for cutting through the spine of Japanese logistics. The new tactic was simple in theory, brutal in reality. Aircraft approached at 50 to 100 feet above the water, guns blazing to suppress every weapon pointing skyward. At the perfect moment, usually between 200 and 400 yards, the pilot released a bomb fitted with a delayed fuse. The bomb hit the water, skipped once or twice like a stone, and slammed into the hull. Moments later, under the surface, it detonated. It was innovation delivered at the speed of desperation, and soon that innovation would be tested. Japanese intelligence had determined that the garrisons at Leh needed reinforcements. A major convoy was assembling at Rabaul. 8 large transports carrying nearly 7,000 men, escorted by 8 destroyers. This would be Japan's largest reinforcement effort since the start of the New Guinea campaign. If successful, thousands of fresh troops would bolster the defense of Leh, slowing or even breaking Allied momentum. If destroyed, Japan would not recover on this front. Allied intelligence intercepted the signals. Fighter sweeps confirmed movement. Reconnaissance crews tracked the convoy through deteriorating weather. Kenny gathered every available aircraft. B-17S for high-altitude strikes. Beaufighters for low-level strafing. P-38S for air cover. And Gunn's modified B-25 Strafers, now the sharpest blade in the theater. On February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy left Rabaul. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura led the escort, believing the weather would protect them. Storms raged across the Bismarck Sea, scattering clouds like drifting curtains. Rain hammered the decks of the transports. Below deck, soldiers, many seasick, exhausted or cramped in the dark, felt the ship sway under the weight of the storm. March 1st, the weather shielded them. March 2nd, the clouds broke. At 10 a.m., B-17S appeared. Bombs fell from altitude, forcing destroyers to weave and transports to break formation. Little damage was done, but time was lost. The convoy slowed, the waters narrowed, Japan's window began to close. At Cape Ward Hunt, the modified B-25s waited. Pilots checked their harmonization boards. Gunners inspected ammunition belts and barrel cooling vents. Engines drummed the earth with low vibrations. Larner stood before his squadron, quiet and steady. His pilots did not need speeches. They knew what would come next. A wall of anti-aircraft fire, salt spray smashing against cockpit glass, ships looming large enough to fill an entire window. And they knew why they had to do it. If this convoy reached Leh, the campaign might stall for months. Before takeoff, Gunn walked along the row of aircraft. He touched each nose lightly, as if confirming his machines were ready. They were more than aircraft to him. They were tools for closing the distance between himself and Manila. By dawn on March 3rd, the convoy was within striking distance. The sky cleared. Visibility stretched for miles. The sea lay calm, too calm, almost unnatural after the storms. Then specks appeared on the horizon, dozens of them. Then engines rumbled. Then sunlight flashed off wings. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had begun. B-17s attacked first, drawing the eyes of gunners upward. Then bow fighters came in low, strafing the decks with tremendous force, and then cutting through the sea spray came the modified B-25s. They dropped to mast height. They aimed at destroyers and transports alike. 8.50 caliber guns roared in unison, stitching fire across decks, smashing gun positions, tearing apart bridges and superstructures. In seconds, confusion spread among Japanese crews. Bombs skipped across the surface. 1, 2 bounces, and struck hulls with bone-cracking impact. Moments later, underwater blasts ripped through keels and engine rooms. The convoy's formation collapsed. Ships veered, collided, burned. Sailors jumped into the water to escape fire. Destroyers tried to shield transports but were overwhelmed. Gunn, watching from the operations post, said nothing. But those near him saw his knuckles whiten as each report came in. Every ship sinking was a step closer to the Philippines. Every destroyed transport meant fewer enemy soldiers his family would face on the ground. For him, each explosion was another thread pulling the war toward its end. By mid-morning, the sea was a landscape of columns of smoke and spiraling wreckage. By noon, 4 transports were sinking. By late afternoon, the sea was littered with debris and thousands of men struggling to stay afloat. The Japanese convoy was finished, but this was only the beginning of the transformation the battle would unleash. A shift in air-sea warfare, a collapse of Japanese logistics in New Guinea, and the rise of an aircraft built not by official doctrine, but by a man fighting to save the people he loved. Dawn broke on March 3rd, 1943, with a clarity that seemed almost cruel. The storms of the previous days had vanished, leaving behind a sky so clean it revealed every movement on the Bismarck Sea. Sunlight spilled across the surface, turning patches of oil into shimmering mirrors. The Japanese convoy, 8 transports and 8 destroyers, pushed forward, unaware that the greatest test of its existence was minutes away. In the dim light aboard the transports, thousands of Japanese soldiers awoke to the same cramped darkness they had endured for days. Their uniforms clung to their skin in the humid air. Some had not eaten properly since leaving Rabaul. Others struggled with the smell of fuel, sweat, and seasickness. The creaking of hulls and the constant thud of engines formed a monotone rhythm. They had no idea it would be the last sound many of them ever heard. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the deck of the destroyer Shirayuki, watching the horizon through binoculars. His face showed little emotion, but there was a heaviness in his eyes, an understanding that even well-escorted convoys could die in the shadow of Allied air power. He knew they were close to the danger zone. He also believed his destroyers could handle whatever the Americans sent, but the Americans had brought something new. At Cape Ward Hunt, the modified B-25 Strafers were warming their engines. Pilots ran their hands along the instrument panels, feeling the vibration of twin Wright R2-600 engines under their boots. The aircraft smelled of cordite, sweat, and metal, an odor that lingered from the test firing done the night before. 8.50 caliber guns sat ready in each nose, converging at a preset distance for maximum devastation. Major Ed Larner walked between the aircraft, meeting each pilot's eyes. The expression was the same for all of them. Calm concentration mixed with an understanding that today would test every lesson learned over months of low-altitude training. Larner spoke quietly. "Keep the formation tight, hit fast, hit low, no second passes unless you must." The pilots nodded. No one asked about the Japanese defenses. No one mentioned the anti-aircraft guns. They all knew what waited ahead. A wall of fire, spray hitting the windshield at 80 feet, the risk of clipping a mast, the sudden roar of enemy fighters diving from above. Flying low meant absolute commitment. To hesitate was to die. As the sun climbed, the first B-17s appeared over the convoy. Their shadows crossed the decks, alerting sailors below. Anti-aircraft gunners rushed to their stations, tracer fire streaking upward. Bombs fell from altitude, forcing destroyers to maneuver. The blasts were distant, splashes of white water rising beside the ships. The high-altitude bombers did little damage, but they achieved their purpose. They drew attention upward, and that was when the bow fighters arrived. Roaring in from the north at wave-top height, their 20-millimeter cannons erupted with a force that rattled every deck they passed. The gunners aboard the transports barely had time to react. Some weapons fired blind into the smoke. Others were destroyed before they fired a single round. The bow fighters cut long, burning lines across the decks, killing gunners, tearing apart light weapons, and forcing the Japanese to split their fire between sky and sea. Then came the moment Gunn had built his aircraft for. The modified B-25s appeared behind the bow fighters, dropping even lower, their propellers carving paths through the spray. Each aircraft lined itself with a chosen target, preparing for a single pass that would determine the fate of thousands. Lieutenant Walter Hanks tightened his grip on the yoke. "Target, Kyokusei Maru," he said into his intercom. His co-pilot answered with a steady voice. "Locked. 8 guns ready." At 1,000 yards, Hanks squeezed the trigger. The nose of the B-25 erupted in flame and sound. 8.50 caliber guns spat fire, sending thousands of rounds tearing into the transport's forward deck. Tracers walked across the ship, shredding railings, tearing through gun crews, pulverizing the bridge windows. Smoke and sparks shot upward as explosions triggered secondary fires. Hanks held steady, fighting the vibration. The smell of burned powder seeped into the cockpit. The ship grew larger and larger in the windshield until it felt close enough to touch. "Bombs out!" the bombardier yelled. 2 500-pound bombs dropped from the bay. They struck the water, skipped across the waves, and slammed into the hull below the waterline. Hanks pulled up sharply, engines screaming, wings shuddering. Seconds later, 2 underwater detonations tore the bottom out of Kyokusei Maru. Once the blast faded, smoke and seawater poured upward as the transport began to die. Around the convoy, the same sequence played out again and again. Captain Okada aboard Teo Maru watched in disbelief as a B-25 approached his ship head-on. He saw the nose guns flash. He saw men fall. He saw the bombs skip once, then twice before disappearing into the hull. The explosion shook the ship so violently that even the destroyer escorts felt the echo through the water. Within minutes, Teo Maru listed heavily, fires spreading across her midsection. Down the convoy line, Nojima Maru attempted evasive maneuvers, but the sea was too calm and the transports too overloaded to respond quickly. A B-25 came in low, its guns carving a line across the deck. A second B-25 followed, striking the stern and ripping open the engine room. The smell of fuel and burning wood filled the air. The destroyers tried desperately to weave into defensive positions, firing tracers in every direction, but they were overwhelmed. Their guns could not track aircraft that roared in at less than 100 feet. Their formation fell apart. The convoy turned into chaos. Above it all, P-38 fighters engaged Zeros that scrambled from Leh. Dogfights spiraled upward while the sea burned below. Trails of black smoke twisted through the sky. But the turning point of the day did not come from above. It came from the sea. The Japanese convoy lost cohesion. Ships collided during sudden turns. Orders became confused. Radio calls overlapped. Smoke obscured signals. The navigators could barely see their own escorts. What had begun as an organized reinforcement effort was now an uncontrolled disaster. Aboard Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura issued orders with a voice ironed flat by discipline. But even he could not deny what was happening. The convoy would not reach Leh, not intact, not even close. The sea around him was becoming a graveyard. Back at Cape Ward Hunt, Gunn listened to the incoming reports. The messages were short, clipped, factual. Pilots did not exaggerate. They did not celebrate. They simply described what they saw. Transport burning. Destroyer hit forward. Multiple survivors in the water. Enemy formation broken. Gunn stood still for a long time, hands clasped behind his back. He did not smile. He did not nod. He only breathed out slowly, as if releasing something tightly wound inside his chest. He had been waiting more than a year for a moment like this. Not because he wanted the enemy to suffer, but because every destroyed ship meant fewer enemy troops in the Philippines. Fewer soldiers standing between him and his family. By late morning, the convoy was collapsing. By noon, half the transports were crippled or sinking. By mid-afternoon, the destroyers were in full retreat, leaving behind wreckage, oil fires, and thousands of men struggling to swim in blackened water. The turning point had arrived, unmistakable and irreversible. Japan had lost the ability to move large formations across the Bismarck Sea in daylight. They had lost the confidence that destroyers could protect transports. They had lost the momentum of reinforcing New Guinea, and they had lost it to an aircraft born of desperation, conceived in a hangar by a man who refused to surrender his family to fate. As the sun began to fall and the smoke drifted across the sea in long dark ribbons, one truth became clear. The convoy would never reach Leh, and the Battle of the Bismarck Sea had entered its final descent. What remained now was the aftermath, the chase, and the reckoning, a story the next. The afternoon of March 3rd, 1943 settled over the Bismarck Sea like a heavy curtain, the sunlight dim behind drifting layers of smoke, turning the sky into a muted copper haze. Waves slapped against burning wreckage. Oil floated across the surface in long, dark sheets, and scattered through this vast stain were the silhouettes of men, survivors of the morning attack, clinging to debris, drifting with no direction. For those Japanese soldiers and sailors still alive, the sea no longer felt like water. It felt like a place that absorbed sound, memory, and hope. Some men held onto wooden planks. Some wrapped their arms around barrels slick with oil. Others tread water, exhausted, faces half submerged. Many were wounded, burned, bleeding, or blinded by smoke. The first sensation they all shared was silence. Not the peaceful silence of calm water, but the eerie stillness that follows catastrophe. It did not last long. Soon came the voices. Shouts for help, prayers whispered through cracked lips, commands yelled in desperation by petty officers trying to impose order on chaos. But no voice could rise above the smell of fuel or the stinging spray carried by the wind. The Bismarck Sea had become a vast chamber of echoes, and every echo spoke of death. On what remained of Kembu Maru, a surviving corporal tried to pull a wounded sailor from a flooded corridor. Hot steam hissed from ruptured pipes. Broken cables dangled like vines. The metal hull groaned with each wave, as though the ship itself were dying. "Hold on," he yelled, but the sailor's hands slipped from the rail, skin coated in the thick film of oil covering everything. There was no enemy aboard. No firefight, just a slow, suffocating descent into darkness. For many, the true horror of the battle had only begun. At Cape Ward Hunt, the air was thick with fuel vapor and tension. Crew chiefs replaced overheated barrels. Armorers fed new belts into the 50 caliber guns, checking every link. Pilots stood beside their B-25s, drinking water in quick gulps, eyes unfocused as if replaying the morning in their minds. The morning attack had drained them. Flying at mast height had pushed their nerves to the edge. The roar of guns still echoed through their skulls. But none of that mattered. They would have to return. Lieutenant Walter Hanks sat on the edge of a supply crate, staring at the ground. His gloves lay beside him, each fingertip smudged with soot and cordite. His co-pilot knelt and retied his bootlaces. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Hanks nodded. Not because he felt ready, but because there was no room not to be. When they climbed back into the cockpit, the familiar smell of metal and burned oil settled over them like a shroud. The vibrations from the idling engines rolled up through the seats, steady and unforgiving. One by one, the modified B-25s taxied out. The roar of the engines merged into a single rising howl. Gunn's creation, 8 guns forward, all harmonized to converge on a single point, waited to be tested again. And the Japanese survivors floating in the sea did not yet know that a second wave was already forming. Aboard Yukikaze, one of the few destroyers still able to maneuver, officers scrambled to update formation maps. The ink blurred each time the ship lurched. Their charts showed fewer and fewer friendly vessels. Shirakumo, lost. Asashio, unresponsive. Arashio, damaged and drifting. Teiyo Maru, gone. Kembu Maru, sinking. Each update felt like a blow. The deck vibrated beneath them as the engines strained. Smoke drifted across the sky like a second horizon. And somewhere out there, beyond the haze, the Americans would return. A junior officer asked, voice trembling despite his effort to hide it, "Will they attack again today?" Admiral Kimura lowered his binoculars. "They will come," he said. "And when they do, we must endure." But endurance no longer felt like a strategy. It felt like a sentence. Late afternoon, the air hung heavy and motionless, as if the sea itself was waiting. Then from the west came the distant hum of engines. At first it was faint, almost imaginary. But within moments the sound grew, steady, powerful, undeniable. The survivors in the water heard it long before they saw the aircraft. Many turned their faces to the sky with hollow stares. Some prayed. Some screamed for help. Others closed their eyes, ready for the inevitable. The B-25s appeared in formation, sunlight catching on their wings. Hanks lowered his plane toward Kembu Maru, now barely afloat. The deck was tilted at an unnatural angle. Men clung to railings. Some jumped into the sea, their bodies splashing into the oily water below. At 800 yards, Hanks opened fire. The guns unleashed a continuous stream of tracer fire that tore across the ship's midsection. Metal erupted in bursts of sparks. Bodies vanished behind waves of smoke and debris. The ship did not explode dramatically. It simply gave up, tilting, sinking as the sea rose. The glow of burning ships faded slowly on the horizon as March 4th, 1943 came to a close. A gray mist rolled over the Bismarck Sea, softening the outlines of wreckage that still dotted the water. For a few brief moments, the sea looked calm, almost peaceful, until sunlight touched the oil slicks and revealed the truth beneath the surface. The final transport had vanished beneath the waves. The last destroyer still afloat was limping toward Rabaul, smoke trailing behind it. And scattered across dozens of miles were the remains of a force Japan had believed would turn the tide in New Guinea. The convoy was gone. Thousands were dead, and the sea, now quiet, hid the violence it had witnessed just hours before. Far away in New Guinea, at the Allied forward base, the men who had carried out the attack sat in silence. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind exhaustion, deep, bone-deep exhaustion that made their hands tremble and their eyes droop. It was over. The convoy they had trained months to destroy had ceased to exist, but no one felt triumphant. What they had done had been necessary, but necessity and comfort were not the same thing. For the Japanese survivors, those few still clinging to life, the second night on the water was worse than the first. Darkness concealed nothing. The sea was cold. Wounds festered. Oil-stained faces struggled to stay above the surface. Some men hallucinated lights that were not there. Some whispered their children's names until the sea swallowed their words. Others stared at the sky, watching stars blur as their strength left them. By dawn on March 5th, only small groups remained. Destroyers from Rabaul tried to rescue who they could, But each hour brought more bodies drifting away from the convoy's intended path. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in its after-action reports, used a phrase that would echo for decades. It was a blizzard of steel. But the sea offered a simpler judgment. They were gone. At the Allied base, the morning briefing on March 5th felt surreal. Pilots who had spent the last 2 days flying at wave-top height now sat on wooden benches, eating rations in mechanical bites. Their uniforms were stiff with dried salt and oil. General Kenny stood at the front of the room. His voice was steady, but even he looked older than he had 2 days earlier. "Gentlemen," he said, "yesterday changed the war." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what he meant. The Bismarck Sea was no longer an abstract place on the map. It was a graveyard, a turning point, a lesson written in fire and steel. When Kenny finished speaking, there was no applause, only nods, slow, tired, understanding. The men were proud, but pride felt hollow. They had done what the war demanded, not more, not less. In a makeshift operations room in New Guinea, Pappy Gunn stood over a large map pinned to a plywood board. Colored pins marked the convoy's last known positions. Notes scribbled in pencil listed the sinkings. He read each one carefully. Kyokusei Maru, Kembu Maru, Teiyo Maru, Oigawa Maru, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Shirayuki. Each name was a separate story. Each story ended the same way. A mechanic approached with a clipboard. "Sir, more reports coming in from the recon flights." Gunn didn't take the clipboard immediately. He stared at the map as though expecting it to move. Then he whispered something the mechanic barely heard. It should have happened sooner. For Gunn, each ship sunk meant fewer Japanese supplies traveling toward the Philippines. Each day Japan struggled to reinforce New Guinea was one day closer to the land where his wife and children were imprisoned. He did not celebrate victory. He evaluated it. How much closer was he now? How many miles had been cut away between him and their freedom? How many missions still stood between them? For Gunn, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not history, it was personal math, and the numbers were finally beginning to fall in his favor. In Rabaul, Japanese officers gathered in a dimly lit bunker. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the bitter scent of wet uniforms. Maps lay spread across the table, arrows showing routes that no longer existed. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura was dead. His destroyer had been torn apart. Most of his officers had drowned. The surviving commanders argued. Some blamed the weather. Some accused the crews of incompetence. Some insisted the Americans must have used a new type of weapon. But one officer, older, quieter, spoke after letting the room exhaust itself. "No convoy can move under skies the enemy owns," he said. The room fell silent. His words were not an admission. They were a realization. The Japanese commanders knew now what the Americans had understood since mid-1942. Control the air, and everything below becomes vulnerable. The next morning, Tokyo sent a message to Rabaul. "Avoid daylight convoys. All future troop transfers must use night operations, barges, and submarines." It was not a strategy, it was a concession. Japan had lost more than a convoy. It had lost the ability to reinforce New Guinea. The Bismarck Sea had redrawn the map. Far from the battle site, Allied ground forces advancing through Papua noticed something subtle but unmistakable in the days that followed. Japanese counterattacks stopped. Supply dumps captured by Allied patrols were nearly empty. Enemy troops fought, but without ammunition, without rations, without reinforcements. A captain of the 7th Australian Division wrote in his diary, "The jungle felt the same, but the enemy did not. Their footsteps were lighter. Their guns fired less. It was as if something had been cut behind them." He was right. Something essential had been severed. Their lifeline. The Bismarck Sea did not just destroy a convoy, it collapsed an entire logistics chain. In combat zones across New Guinea, a new sound began to carry across valleys and ridges. The deep rising growl of twin Wright R-2600 engines, the metallic chatter of forward-firing 50 caliber guns, the sudden devastating roar of bombs skipping across water or bursting through treetops. Soldiers on the ground learned to recognize it instantly. Japanese troops came to fear it. American and Australian troops came to rely on it. Some called it the Flying Saw, others the Jungle Reaper. But among the crews, the name that stuck was simple: the Strafer. It was not elegant, it was not precise, it was not refined, but it worked. And for the first time since the war began, the men in the Pacific felt they had an aircraft that belonged to their environment, designed not by distant engineers, but shaped by the hands of a man who understood the war firsthand. In the weeks after the battle, Allied intelligence noticed something unusual. Japanese signals traffic decreased. Convoy planning was almost non-existent. Submarine requests increased. Barge routes multiplied. It was clear Japan was adjusting, but not recovering. The loss of nearly 6,000 men in a single operation had crippled the 51st Division before it ever reached the battlefield. One intelligence officer summarized it in his report. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea delayed Japanese operations in New Guinea by at least 6 months, possibly more. Those 6 months became an opportunity the Allies seized. Airfields were built. New units arrived. Offensives began. And the long push toward the Philippines became possible. The death of a convoy had reshaped the future. Months after the battle, Pappy Gunn sat alone beside a runway in New Guinea, a wrench in one hand and a piece of dismantled turret in the other. His hair was grayer now, his gait slower, his body marked by wounds from years of combat. But he kept working, not because he was ordered to, not because it was required, but because staying still made the waiting harder. Then one afternoon in late 1944, a messenger approached with a folded paper. Gunn took it without ceremony. He opened it slowly. He read the message twice. "Stumbert Thomas internment camp liberated. Your family safe. Details to follow." For a moment he did nothing. He didn't speak. He didn't stand. He didn't even breathe. Then the wrench fell from his hand. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, the war around him felt distant. His family was alive. They had survived. Everything he had done, every rule he broke, every risk he took, it had led here. He did not cry. He simply sat in silence, letting the weight of the moment rest in his chest. No victory in New Guinea, no medal, no promotion could compare to this. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the men of the Pacific returned home. Some returned quietly, some returned broken, some never returned at all. But the aircraft they flew, the modified B-25s Gunn had created, lived on. Air forces around the world studied skip bombing. Engineers examined the strafer nose configuration. Tactical schools rewrote entire sections of their manuals. The idea of turning a bomber into a gun platform became standard. Future aircraft, AC-47s, AC-119, AC-130, owed their lineage to a workshop in New Guinea. In decades to come, historians would describe the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a turning point, a milestone, a tactical revolution. But for the men who lived it, it was simpler. It was the day the Pacific War began to tilt. Standing on the shore years later, veterans spoke about the battle with hesitant voices. Some remembered the gunfire. Some remembered the smoke. Some remembered the strange beauty of skip bombs bouncing across the water like silver stones. But all remembered the sea that swallowed ships, the sea that carried men, the sea that hid secrets the world would never fully understand. One pilot said it best. When we flew low, we saw everything. We saw them. We saw fear. We saw courage. We saw the cost. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not just a victory, it was a demonstration of what happens when innovation meets desperation, when necessity drives invention, when one man's personal war becomes a turning point in a global conflict. And long after the wreckage rusted away, long after the waves smoothed the scars of battle, the sea still remembered, because some places do not forget. Not entirely, not ever.